Hello. So, welcome to my Zoom presentation on Quizlet. My name is Martin, and this is my second Zoom presentation for PIPD 3240. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about how learning and memory work cognitively in the brain. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can improve our learning and memory. And I'm going to talk about how Quizlet is, what it is, and how it helps to um, helps our learning and memory. All right, so just real quickly for context, Quizlet is it's an online study app. So it's based on kind of the flashcard principle, and they have some practice testing functions as well. And it works on two basic educational principles, two core values of spaced learning and retrieval practice. So to start off, how does learning memory work? Well, we learn by putting knowledge information into our short-term memory. And then through usage, through application of this knowledge in our short-term memory, we strengthen neural connections and then in our brain, and then this knowledge gets shifted from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, which is what we want, because our long-term memory is our long-term memory. That's better for retention of knowledge and information and long-term understanding and recall of the learning that we've done. There's one fairly important element involved here, and they call that the refractory period. So this is kind of it's a pause. Um, it's a timing interval in the sense of there's only so much that our short-term memory can hold. We can overload our short-term memory. We get mentally fatigued. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but it's kind of like an audio cassette tape where, or even modern kind of continuous recording technology where once it's full, any new information kind of pushes out old information. So that's kind of how our short-term memory works, and we can overload that. So like a long lecture session or a long reading session can overload our short-term memory, and just mentally we get dragged down and fatigued a little bit. We just don't retain as much because our short-term memory is full. It doesn't have a chance to kind of get shifted into long-term memory. So a pause, a rest is good for helping to shift our short-term memory into long-term memory. And I use the analogy of the tortoise and the hare here, where the hare got off to a quick start. He's fast, runs fast, got off to a head start, but got overloaded, got fatigued, had to take a rest, versus the tortoise just kind of plugging away, doing its thing, taking a break when it needs to, just kind of slow and steady wins the race. And the tortoise did, in the end, win the race. And I think this is a good analogy for how learning and memory work. We can't just go in spurts and um, fast and hard spurts. We need kind of that break. We need to reduce that mental fatigue. Another important element for learning and memory is what they call the forgetting curve. So a German theorist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, back in the 19th century, he did a lot of practice and testing on himself to come up with this forgetting curve. And so he found that we forget a lot of information in a very short period of time. We've got up to our full knowledge input, where we're subject matter experts, and within an hour we forgot over half of what we initially learned. And then after a few days, we're down to maybe a quarter or a third of what we initially learned. So this is a big impediment to long-term learning and memory. But it can be overcome. So how can we overcome this forgetting curve? Well, two main principles of spaced learning and retrieval practice. A large study was done in 2013, Lusky and et al. And they examined a dozen or so learning and study techniques, and they found that they determined that the two most effective learning and study techniques were spaced learning and retrieval practice. So what is spaced learning and retrieval practice? Spaced learning, we know without knowing or not having the vocabulary for it. It is review, practice, and study. This is kind of traditionally what we would consider review and study. So we know intuitively that we need to study before a test. We know intuitively that we need to practice physical skills to be able to improve. And through this repetition, through this usage, that is how our short-term memory, our short-term knowledge, or how our knowledge is shifted from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. So spaced learning kind of spaces out our learning into kind of chunks, review chunks, as opposed to kind of the more traditional kind of, you have a big a lecture session and then cram just before the exam. There is some value in that, but it's better to space it out a little more evenly. Again, the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race. So, and if we're thinking about our 4E framework, this is a very well-established educational principle. So to graphically represent how spaced learning helps, we have our black forgetting curve here. But if we can, once we start adding in review and study sessions, we build our knowledge back up after we've forgotten a lot. We're still subject to the forgetting curve. So after some of our study sessions, we'll start forgetting again. But the next study session, we'll build ourselves up again and gradually kind of increase our knowledge, our retention. So at each spaced learning interval, we start flattening out the forgetting curve. We start forgetting less and retaining more, shifting our knowledge from short-term memory into long-term memory. And over time, we build up our overall knowledge retention, and instead of kind of sticking in or falling into our initial forgetting curve, we now get kind of an upward trending learning curve. Retrieval practice kind of goes hand in hand with spaced learning, and it's more or it can be conceived as kind of like a proper application of spaced learning. So it's we can do our spaced review study, but we can do it in a passive way where we're just reviewing our notes or rereading the text. Retrieval practice puts a little bit more intention into kind of the review and study, and kind of rather than passively reviewing our notes, we sit with a question and force ourselves to kind of think about what the answer could be, or what the information is. So this process of actively kind of digging into our memory banks, again, it strengthens the neural connections, moving our knowledge from short-term into long-term memory. This kind of this brain exercise. Our brain needs to exercise, just like our body and our muscles need exercise. Our brain needs exercise for better long-term retention of knowledge. And looking at the 4E framework, this is, again, very well-established educational principle. And to demonstrate this, or kind of to show some research regarding retrieval practice, excuse me. So initial learning sessions versus with a final test afterwards, after some period of time. Retrieval practice would be kind of like having practice tests in between our initial learning and our final test. So on our graphs here, a few different studies, depending on the timelines involved. After a couple of days with no retrieval practice, with no practice testing, we've forgotten over 80% of our initial knowledge. After a week, we've almost forgotten everything. But with retrieval practice, we can retain and recall much more knowledge for our final test. So looking at the 4E framework, this falls under evaluation, where these practice tests are formative assessment, and they help move knowledge from our short-term to our long-term memory, which allows us to recall the knowledge for a longer period of time. So how does Quizlet work? I'm going to, again, I'm going to quickly show Quizlet itself. So, but again, it kind of works on these principles: space learning, retrieval practice, through flashcards. There's practice testing functions within Quizlet. So I'm just going to quickly jump to Quizlet. So here's an example. Now Quizlet has existing kind of sets of flashcards or knowledge banks. You can create your own. There's a fair amount of flexibility and variability in how you want to set it up. So I've just found a history set of information here. So we're in flashcard mode right now. So we're started off with a flashcard here, flashcard question. So true or false? The Royal Canadian Mounted Police was originally formed to search for gold in the Yukon Territory. I believe that to be false. So I'm going to flip my flashcard. Oh, I'm wrong. It was actually true. And so I can continue on through my flashcard set here, a whole bunch of questions. I've clicked to flip over to the answer side of my flashcard and so on and so forth. Excuse me. And there are a few other functions here. So there's like a matching game where, again, it takes kind of the information bank that you've inputted into Quizlet, rearranges it into kind of a matching game where you're given a question and you try to find the answer. There's what they call a learning function, which kind of, again, turns kind of your information bank into kind of individual sort of practice questions. So you can have multiple choice, you can have written answers, and then there's a test function here. So this is now kind of like a mock test. So it's kind of regurgitated all your inputted question and answers into various test questions. And then so rather than just kind of like a continuous line of flashcards or matching or questioning multiple choice, it now kind of limits it to kind of like a mock exam, mock test. So 20 question test here. I don't see the answers right away. So this is kind of my applying my the retrieval practice where I don't see the answers right away. I have to dig deep into my memory banks to be able to answer these questions. So practice test, and then at the end, I'll be given the results. And so that provides some additional formative assessment. So yeah, very straightforward, nothing fancy, nothing flashy, but it does the trick. The user interface is very user-friendly, very intuitive. So yeah, through these flashcards, this practice testing, we're thinking about the 4E framework, excitement and engagement. We can see there's a bit of a gamification element to excite a learner. And then to engage learners through the immediate feedback, through the formative assessment, through the being able to, the flashcards, being able to see the answers. It builds up our knowledge, builds up our confidence. This creates self-efficacy and increases learner motivation and engagement in the material. So overall, I would rate, in terms of our 4E framework, I would rate Quizlet. When it comes to educational value, I'd rate it very high. I think it's based on very solid educational principles, space learning, retrieval practice. These are well-established, well-researched principles that Quizlet applies very well. I think it does very well for evaluation because of this, the immediate feedback, formative assessment element of, and the practice testing. The low-risk practice testing, again, is another very well-established educational principle in terms of evaluation. Engagement, I think it does a little bit less. It is ultimately a study app. I think there's a limit in terms of how something like this can be engaging. But I think it still does very, very solid in terms of engagement. In terms of excitement, I think it does less. There's not a lot of fluff. It's not entertaining. It's not flashy. So it's an educational tool. I think it's not meant to be exciting. So having high educational value counteracts this lower excitement value of Quizlet. So yeah, that's about it. Here is my references page that I used for this presentation. I do have a prop quiz applying the principles that we've learned in this presentation. So take a moment. If you've taken some notes during this presentation, don't review your notes because that goes against one of these principles. So sit with these questions for a moment. What two learning principles is Quizlet based on? How do these principles help our learning and memory? And what does Quizlet do to activate these learning principles? So if you sit with those for a moment, and when you're ready, you can pause the presentation here if you like, and I will bring up the answers in a moment. So thank you very much for watching my presentation, and I hope it was informative. And here we go, answers.